General Colin Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On Tuesday, General Powell addressed a gathering at the National Press Club here in Washington, D.C., and the focus during this hour-long event is America's military preparedness. Colin Powell became Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in 1989. He retired from the Army this past Thursday afternoon. We will learn more about his background next with an introduction by Clayton Boyce, who is president of the Press Club.
Almost wait for the green light. My sister got to be in the 7th. She's down here in New York. She teaches upstate. There we go. Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name's Clayton Boyce, and I'm president of the National Press Club and news editor of Knight Ridder Tribune News Service. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you who are watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio or the global Internet Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, I'd like to remind our members of upcoming speakers. On Wednesday, September 29th, Representative John Dingell, Chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, will discuss health care reform. On Wednesday, October 6th, the Secretary General of NATO, Manfred Werner, will present a speech entitled A New NATO for a New Era. Other upcoming luncheon speakers include Labor Secretary Robert Reich, Chairman and CEO of Amgen, Gordon Binder, and author Stephen King. Audio and videotapes of today's Press Club luncheon are available through the National Press Club Library or by calling 1-800-952-TAPE. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up. I'll ask as many as time permits, and time will not permit me to ask them all. I can tell already. Before introducing General Powell, I'd like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. And please hold your applause until all names are read. From your right, Donna Peterson, editor of the Army Times. Juan Walte from USA Today. Otto Kreischer of Copley News Service. Ike Pappas of Ike Pappas Network Productions. Gil Klein, Media General News Service and Vice President of the National Press Club. Frank Alcafer, Washington Bureau Chief of the Milwaukee Journal and past President of the National Press Club. Helen Thomas, United Press International and past President of the Washington Press Club, which had merged with the National Press Club some time ago. Reginald Stewart, Assistant News Editor, Knight Ridder Newspapers, and Chairman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. John Fogerty, editor of the Kiplinger California Letter and past president of the National Press Club and member of the National Press Club Speakers Committee, who arranged today's luncheon. Lawrence O'Rourke, the Sacramento Bee. Mark Thompson, Knight Ridder Newspapers. Suzanne Schaefer of the Associated Press. Richard Sia of the Baltimore Sun. And John Morocco of Aviation Week and Space Technology. I'd also like to thank staff members Melissa Bender, Pat Thornsberry, and Melanie Abdo-Dermott for organizing today's luncheon. General Colin Powell has been well known in the U.S. for some time, and the Gulf War made him world famous. His newfound celebrity can be a burden. He's found he can no longer attend church every Sunday because of his celebrity status, and has had to curtail his trips to the auto parts store to scrounge parts to fuel his hobby, which is refurbishing old Volvos. Those are the negatives. The positives, he is also, according to numerous reports, about to become a very wealthy man. He has a multi-million-dollar book deal. and a contract with the Speaker's Bureau that will bring him hefty five-figure speaking fees. For us, he is speaking today at the government rate, that is to say, for free. I think it's fair to say that General Colin Powell has achieved his fame and fortune, in the words of an old commercial, the old-fashioned way. He's earned it. Colin Powell was born in Harlem. His mother was a seamstress. His father was a shipping clerk. Both of his parents were immigrants from Jamaica. The general was educated in public schools and at the City College of New York. He got his start in the military as an ROTC cadet and was commissioned a lieutenant of infantry. From there, he rose to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Along the way, he served in many positions and places, including two tours of duty in Vietnam. There, he was awarded the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and the Soldier's Medal for his service. And of course, he was the nation's top military commander during the Persian Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was humiliated and Kuwait was liberated. Now, this background would seem to add up to the dream political biography. And it just so happens that General Colin Powell will become Citizen Powell at midnight on Thursday. He is here to talk to us about the role of America's military in the future. And I'm sure many of you here today will ask him about the future of Colin Powell. As Gil Klein, the Vice President of the Press Club, said the other day, right now it looks as if General Powell is the only person who could win either the Democratic or Republican presidential nomination. Without ever setting foot in New Hampshire. Does he plan a career in politics? Is he a Democrat or a Republican? Is it true that the doorbell at his home in Virginia plays Hail to the Chief? Every indication I've seen is that he won't talk about politics until after he retires, long after he retires, perhaps. To deal with these and other matters, it is my pleasure to introduce to you General Colin Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and let me say that we will not be discussing politics. And I am once again delighted to be back at the National Press Club. And before beginning my talk on the role of the military and some of the things we have been doing in recent months and years, let me take this final opportunity perhaps to express my appreciation to the members of the press for the relationship that I've enjoyed with you over the last 6 years. It's been tough and you've ripped me apart a lot, but I think I've managed to survive it. But there are still 2 days left to go. We haven't always agreed on every issue that's come along during my 4 years as chairmanship and my 2 years as National Security Advisor. When you have agreed with me, I've been amazed at your brilliance. When you've disagreed with me, I have been dismayed by your ignorance. But it has always been for the single purpose of making sure that the American people got the best information. We always had the same mission, to keep the American people informed, and to do it in an adversarial way, where the government tries to put out a point of view, and it's the purpose of a free and aggressive press to attack and to come at us, and to make sure that we were always on the mark, that we were serving the American people. And so I thank you for the relationship that we've had over the last several years, and I think the people who have benefited from it most are the people that we treasure the most, the American people. And I once again express my appreciation to you for that relationship. It's a pleasure for me to be here for my third appearance. My first appearance was 5 years ago, and it was a final appearance in a sense because it was the last major speech I gave as National Security Advisor to President Reagan. It was in the fall of 1988 when we were within a few months of the end of the Reagan-Bush administration. I realized the other day that by coincidence, this, of course, is my last major speech as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It is a coincidence, but of course, if I ever appear here again giving a last major speech in some capacity, by then it will become a tradition. Who knows what might happen. But 5 years ago when I was here, the theme of my speech was to talk about what the Reagan presidency had been about with respect to foreign policy. It was a proud record. We could take credit for a number of things. I talked about the historic summit meetings that had been held between President Reagan and President Gorbachev, and I talked at some length about the historic results that had flowed from those meetings. I suggested conservatively 5 years ago that we might be entering a fundamentally new era in our relationships with the Soviet Union. I also noted a number of other things that were happening in the world: the ceasefire in that terrible 8-year-old Iran-Iraq war. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan was underway. The flourishing of democracy under Mrs. Aquino in Manila. I touched on the INF Treaty, a marvelous treaty that had been concluded, which for the first time would begin the process of destroying nuclear weapons and not building them anymore. And I noted at that time that we were on the verge of perhaps having a mandate to begin work on a CFE treaty, conventional forces in Europe, where we could do with conventional forces what we were doing with nuclear weapons, start to disassemble the huge armies that had been created during the course of the Cold War. I also shared some disappointments. I noted that Panama was still under the heel of General Manuel Noriega, and noted that in due course something would have to be done about that. The world, as I would report to President Reagan a few months later on his last day in office, was relatively quiet. There was a feeling of hope. There was a feeling of anticipation. Yes, there was smoldering and bubbling, but overall the world seemed quiet and very hopeful. Little did I know, or did anyone else here at that time know what really was in front of us, what was in store for us for the 5 years between that appearance and my appearance today. Yes, it was quiet for a while, and then the lid blew. 11 months after I spoke here as National Security Advisor, President Bush appointed me to be Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the 1st of October, 1989. In the first 90 days, the Berlin Wall fell. My old friend Manuel Noriega was dealt with. Mrs. Aquino got in trouble, and American armed forces very surgically and precisely came to her assistance one night in December of 1989. The Warsaw Pact started to crumble. Russian Jews were finally being allowed to immigrate in significant numbers. We saw a free government arise in Hungary. Honecker was out in East Germany. Ceausescu out in Romania. We invaded Panama, as I noted, and in that particular operation, we allowed an elected president to assume office. And after those first 90 days, things really began to pick up. Total collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the freeing of Eastern Europe and the rise of democratic institutions and nations and movements around the world. The reunification of Germany, something we thought might take years, suddenly burst upon the world stage in a matter of months. And then we saw the end of communism. The end of communism as a political system. The end of communism as an economic system. The end of communism, more importantly, as a value system. The end of communism as something for people to believe in. We watch now patiently, months ahead, for those few remaining aging starlets in Havana and Pyongyang and one or two other places to catch up with history and realize that their time has passed. And we defeated communism by the strength of our economy, our political system, our value system, our military forces, but ultimately it was a contest between ideas. And the idea, communism, failed. We saw the end of the Soviet Union, and Mr. Gorbachev, that great reformer who did so much, was replaced by a great revolutionary by the name of Boris Yeltsin, who we watch on the stage in Moscow today, pushing that revolution forward. Gorbachev, however, unlike old Soviet leaders, did not disappear and go into oblivion. I discovered that, among other things, he has become an environmentalist, and he is setting up his office at a United States Army base in the Presidio in San Francisco. Is this a great world or what? CFE that we talked about in 1988 actually became a treaty, and the armies that once glowered at each other in Europe began to fall back and shrink. And elsewhere in the world, we saw Nelson Mandela freed to join South Africa's turbulent political process. We saw elections in Namibia and Angola, even in Cambodia. We saw in our newspapers this week how that UN operation has achieved a brilliant success, and the UN was able to turn Cambodia back over to its people. In our hemisphere, we saw the end of conflict in El Salvador and Nicaragua. A democratically elected civilian president in South Korea completed the transition from military rule. We have marveled at the emergence of the United Nations, assuming responsibilities dreamed of by its founders, but only now realizable. There will be difficulties ahead, but we shouldn't allow these UN difficulties to overshadow the immensity of this development. Old enemies becoming new friends and partners, old alliances such as NATO adapting to new roles and realities. Shortly after I became chairman in 1989 and early 90, there was much debate about NATO. Whither NATO was the question that all the Europe think tanks were talking about. Now in 1993, it's not whither NATO, it's how can I get in? Where do I find an application card? How can I join this solid alliance? In the aftermath of the Gulf War, our hostages in Lebanon were released. The major aggressor in the region, Iraq, was neutralized and made irrelevant, even though Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime is still very annoying. And the Middle East peace process re-energized, leading ultimately to the historic ceremony that we all saw just a few weeks ago, where President Clinton presided on the White House lawn over the signing of those agreements between Prime Minister Rabin and Chairman Arafat, where they shook hands in that memorable picture on an agreement to recognize each other. Chairman Arafat, who was also a guest here, wasn't even wearing his trademark pistol that day, but he was turned out in a smartly tailored uniform. And a little while later, that afternoon of the next day, he was asked by an inquisitive reporter why he wore a uniform. And he remarked, "Why not? Chairman Powell wears a uniform." So even in my declining days, I find myself a fashion role model. But who? If I had come to this audience 3 months ago and told you that on Friday, the 24th of September, 1993, the two lead stories combined on the front page of the New York Times would be the Israeli Knesset approving an agreement to recognize the PLO, and right underneath it, the South African Parliament agreeing to integrate blacks into the political process. Amazing times, historic times, unprecedented times. And the United States Armed Forces have been incredibly busy dealing with these historic events. Panama, but that's not all. We rescued United States embassies in Liberia and Somalia. We had to send troops, regretfully, to Los Angeles to deal with a riot that shocked us, and we sent our troops to rescue our fellow Americans in South Florida after a terrible hurricane. We rescued Haitians at sea and ran a camp for them at Guantanamo while working for a restoration of their democracy, a restoration that we hope is almost at hand. We undertook humanitarian operations in a scale never seen before in Bosnia, in Bangladesh, in Guam, in Somalia, in northern Iraq, in Russia, and a dozen other places. And of course, the highlight of all of these activities of the last 4 years can best be characterized as Desert Storm and Norm. Saddam Hussein reminded us, in case we needed any reminding, that there was still evil in the world. And President Bush and Secretary Cheney sent 541,000 Americans 8,000 miles to join a massive coalition to deal with this particular brand of evil, led by General Schwarzkopf, whose brilliant performance, electrified a nation and a world. And those troops under his command did well and made America proud of its armed forces again in a way that we had not seen since VJ and VE days back in 1945. We were engulfed in parades. It got so bad that by July I was getting calls from commanders saying, "Chairman, we've got to stop the parades. The troops are getting tired of parades. Their feet are getting flat. They are getting fat from all of this food that they get at these parade parties. When can we go back to training?" I said, "Not till the American people have had their fill." Those parades bonded us again. People's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard bonded us again with the American people in a way that bridged the estrangement of the post-Korea and post-Vietnam periods. We included in those parades our Vietnam veterans and our Korean buddies and shared with them so that they finally had the parades that they didn't get before. G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe and G.I. Jane again became terms of endearment and not derision. Almost 30 times in the past 4 years, our armed forces have been called on to fight wars, to restore and preserve peace, to relieve pain, to provide hope, to deter aggression, to show the flag, to back up diplomacy, to show the American will, to stand watch quietly in places like Korea, to reassure friends and to sober enemies. In every instance, they've gone about their job with a competency and with a spirit too rarely seen in our country. Proud, patriotic, selfless, drug-free, the best and brightest of American youth. And the American people responded. Perhaps that's why now, as an institution, we are polled as perhaps one of the most highly regarded institutions in the nation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I won't bother comparing the polling data on the American Armed Forces with any groups that might perhaps be represented in this room today. Of this record of accomplishment on the part of the armed forces, I am enormously proud, and I am, of course, enormously proud to have been a member of this group. And yet, for all that has happened in these 5 years, it is probably only a foretaste of the revolutionary events that are just ahead. History seems to be taking two paths. On one path, some nations are moving forward to new democratic futures with hope for their people. President Yeltsin and what he's doing in Russia is a good example. The other path, however, is a little more confused, a little more dangerous. Some have yet to step in other paths, but others have taken this second path and have returned to 1914 to fight out old hatreds and grudges that had been put on hold by the superpower Cold War pause button. So we enter a time of hope and promise, and a time still of great danger and uncertainty. It will take all of our best wisdom to navigate through these troubled times. It will take American leadership. The debates that we're seeing now about unilateralism or multilateralism or isolationism and interventionism and the other isms are somewhat silly, and they miss the point. The point is that history and destiny have made America the leader of the world that would be free. And the world that would be free is looking to us for inspiration. The world that would be free trusts America, trusts our values, trusts our people, trusts what we stand for. We must play that role in whatever form it presents itself. It means political leadership. It means diplomatic leadership. It means economic leadership. And it means leadership of all kinds backed up by a strong military. This isn't to say we will go everywhere and do everything or be the world's policemen. We will have to make choices, and there will be limits, but we cannot step back away from this position of leadership. Where we can make a difference, we must try to make that difference. And so I expect our armed forces to be busier in the days ahead than they have been in the nice, static garrison days of the Cold War. In this torrent of history over the past 4 years, I have had two primary goals as chairman. The first one was to make sure that we accomplished successfully every operational mission assigned to us by the Secretary of Defense, the President, and the American people. Second, to begin the process of restructuring and downsizing all of our armed forces in response to this new changed environment, the absence of the Cold War, and to do it in a way that preserved the capability and the quality of our armed forces. No demobilization, no breaking apart this superb aggregation of young men and women. Others will make the final evaluation, but I feel pretty good about both of these goals. The more difficult of the two was the downsizing and restructuring. The first thing we did a few years ago was to drop the Cold War as a planning assumption. In the absence of a Soviet Union, in the absence of an empire of communism to orchestrate all of this, Cold War was over. World War III was unthinkable. We no longer had to be prepared to fight everywhere in the world at once against an empire. And the new strategic assumption, which was adopted by President Bush and Secretary Cheney in 1990, was to concentrate on fighting two regional conflicts that might emerge. Why two? Because you don't want to be so occupied with one that you don't have a capacity to handle another one and thereby tempt another one. It's as simple as that. I'm pleased that President Clinton and Secretary Aspen have now built on that very simple strategic principle, and we are allowed to move forward with our restructuring of the armed forces. We used first the concept of the base force to control our descent from our Cold War highs. President Clinton has now approved Secretary Aspen's bottom-up review force, which allows us to go down even lower, but a controlled descent. I am not concerned about the name of the force or the name of the process. I am driven by the need to preserve for future presidents, for future secretaries, for future chairmen, for future generations, a force capable of executing any future strategy, of successfully dealing with a future crisis, a crisis that nobody today can predict, but most assuredly will arrive at 2 o'clock one morning sometime in the future. And I am confident, hopeful. My prayer is there'll be a force ready to deal with that crisis when it comes. What we had to do to avoid this rapid demobilization was to begin it in a sensible, prudent manner. We decided to go down about 25%, and now we've accelerated that to go down even further. This hasn't been an easy process. It's been one of the most difficult management challenges ever presented to the Department of Defense. 600 to 700,000 troops are in the process of being discharged. We've cut the size of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force 40%, 25% of the Marine Corps. We've eliminated or will eliminate in the course of the next several years 70% of the nuclear weapons that were in our inventory when I became chairman just 4 years ago. That'll be done shortly after the turn of the century. Hundreds of hardware programs have been cut, hundreds of bases being closed, reserves and civilian employees being reduced by the hundreds of thousands. In the last several years alone, 200,000 troops have been brought home with their families from Europe. Major contraction of the defense industry. So the armed forces, ladies and gentlemen, are paying and will continue to pay a peace dividend. And we have also seen that the peace dividend has temporarily hurt the economy. That will sort itself out in time as our free economic system and the conversion practices of the Department of Defense allow the economy to move into this new direction and away from too much of a reliance on defense spending. And through it all, the force remains ready. The force remains of extremely high quality, with high morale, ready to perform missions and performing difficult missions around the world today. In some ways, the force of today is even better than a few years ago. We have gone a long way toward operating as a team rather than just 4 separate services. You saw that in Desert Storm, where we all came together under a single commander, General Schwarzkopf, and service preferences and parochial considerations were secondary to the needs of the team. But we learned a lot about ourselves in Desert Storm. We found that we had to make improvements, and we've been hard at work for the last 2 years making those improvements. We worked hard then to come up with joint doctrine for all services, joint procedures for all services. We don't want to unify the services, however. Some critics of mine have suggested that in the roles and missions work I've done, I didn't go far enough with respect to merging the activities of the services. Some people would even take it to the extreme, and I'm rather critical of these views. I'm not interested in creating the Aeroflot model in the armed forces of the United States. We need each and every one of our services. They bring forward from the past proud traditions. I have yet to find a combat capability in any of those four services we did not have a need for at some time over the last 4 years. So we could do better. We can get rid of redundancy, but let's not get rid of complementarity where it serves the nation's purpose. We have to remember also that we're warriors. We're not a church picnic group. We're warriors. And I want every Air Force fighter pilot to go into the sky believing he's the best fighter pilot in the world. He's a Top Gun alongside his Navy counterpart. I want them to believe each one is better than the other. I want an American Marine infantryman to believe there is no infantryman better on the face of the earth, and I want an Army American infantryman to be sure that that Marine is wrong because he's better than he is. That kind of competition serves our interest well. It gives you the kind of proud force that we have now. But when it's time to do a mission, when it's time to go to war, all of that gets set aside, and it has to be one team going to war. On any one crisis, one service might get the game ball, but it takes the team to win. Tomorrow in Norfolk, Virginia, or later this week in Norfolk, Virginia, probably Friday, we're going to take this one step forward when we redesignate the United States Atlantic Command with a new mission. Traditionally, all of our forces in overseas theaters worked for a single commander. Thus, everybody in Europe works for General Schwarzkopf. Everybody in the Pacific works for Admiral Larson. But here in the United States, the services maintain control over the operational training of units here in the United States, so that the Army had principal responsibility for large unit training of Army units, similarly with the other services. What we are going to do with this Atlantic Command, we're going to give the Atlantic Command the operational control of all of the available, deployable, active forces here in the United States. And the responsibility of that command will be to train them as joint teams. Train them so that when the whistle blows and a General Schwarzkopf needs troops in the future or a General Thurman needs troops in Panama, what they will receive are forces that have been trained jointly by a single commander whose headquarters is in Norfolk. No more pickup games. You're going to get forces ready to go to combat right away. And since it is no longer just a Navy command with a focus on the Russian Navy, no longer a problem, the commander of our Atlantic Command may be a naval officer, an Army officer, a Marine officer, an Air Force officer. From now on, best person gets the job, no longer service-oriented. So we're going to be doing more and more things like that. We are starting to send Navy instructor pilots to Air Force schools and Air Force instructor pilots to Navy schools so we can ultimately integrate the training of all of our pilots. We have done quite a bit in terms of integrating our strategic forces. We're going into the common development of aircraft components. More will follow as this team concept really becomes embedded within the Department of Defense. And I want to give great credit to my colleagues in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, brilliant military leaders, dedicated military leaders, for their efforts to bring this about. They are not what you all refer to all the time as the Pentagon brass, a term I absolutely detest. And if you're going to give me a gift as a result of this luncheon, do not give me some cheap mug. What I want you to do What I want you to do is go back to your computers. What I want you to do is go back to your computers and get rid of the term Pentagon brass. Is that too much to ask? Probably. But I make the case anyway. We have some of the most distinguished leaders in the armed forces of the United States, and that's what you ought to call them and not the Pentagon brass. But alas, I know I dream. You see how proud I am of this force. One of the questions that is always in everybody's mind is how and when do we use that force? What are the circumstances under which you commit the armed forces of the United States? And I am usually characterized in this debate as the reluctant warrior and someone who always seeks decisive results. I'm guilty. I'm guilty. Because the fact of the matter is that one of the most important decisions that a president has to make is to commit the armed forces of the United States in combat. And the single most important job, the legal job, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the other chiefs of staff, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have, is to advise the President and the Secretary of Defense on issues relating to the commitment of those armed forces. This is not an abstract intellectual exercise. It is nothing less than sending young American sons and daughters off to a foreign land to fight other sons and daughters, perhaps to kill them and to be killed. And sometimes it does end tragically, as we saw again this past weekend in Somalia, where we lost 3 of our youngsters in that terrible tragedy with the helicopter. But it's what they are trained to do. They're warriors. It's why we have armed forces. But it is never a decision to be taken lightly. We are not committing mercenaries. We are committing sons and daughters. And committing forces of the United States also means that you're committing the will and the strength of the American people. We must go into battle with the support and understanding of the American people. Frequently, a president has to make a quick decision and to go into battle before he really knows what the American people might think about his action. But in due course, the American people will indicate their support of a particular decision. And that decision should always be made, in my view, with a clear purpose in mind. And if it isn't possible to come up with a clear purpose, if the situation, as is too often the case, is murky, then you should understand its murkiness and know that as you go into this, you have to find the clarity that you will eventually need. Reluctance to use military force is an American military tradition. I can trace it back from Washington to Grant to Eisenhower, since war is ultimately a political act, not a military act. Give political tools the opportunity to work first. Military power can back up political tools and make them credible. We saw that in the Cold War, which we prevailed in without firing a shot. And it is the responsibility of military leaders to ensure that political leaders have an analysis of all the options, the good, the bad, the popular, the unpopular, the fashionable, the unfashionable. And only then, when the candid advice of the military leaders are provided to our political leaders, can they then make proper decisions, make that political decision that the Constitution only gives them the right to do, and then we, the military leaders, execute. And my view is we should always execute for decisive results. Decisive doesn't mean overwhelming. Decisive means decisive. It means committing the force needed to achieve the political objective. If the political objective is very, very limited, very circumscribed, the force should still be decisive in order to achieve that limited objective. The Philippines is one of my favorite examples. On the 1st of December, I think it was 1989, late at night, we got a call from help, the Philippine government. Rebellion was underway. We want you to come bomb Philippine Air Base, where Philippine planes were taking off to attack Mrs. Aquino. We examined it quickly. We made some judgments and decided that in this case, we didn't need to apply overwhelming force. We thought that just sending some F-4 fighters with great young Air Force pilots aboard, buzzing the airfield, would be enough to keep those planes on the ground without us having to kill a single person. Precise application of military force for a very limited objective. And we made it all up within about 2 hours, and the mission was over in 2.5 hours. The instructions we gave to the pilots were very simple and clear. Go over the airfield and demonstrate extreme hostile intent. They did. Mission completed. My philosophy in all this is rather simple. Match political expectations to military means in a coldly realistic way. Don't slide in. Don't mislead yourself. This isn't some syndrome I'm suffering from. It comes from 35 years of experience. As a first lieutenant, I saw what doing otherwise was. The results were in the Bay of Pigs with President Kennedy. As a major and a captain and a lieutenant colonel, I saw what doing otherwise produced in Vietnam. And in Beirut, as a major general in 1983, I saw what doing otherwise can result in. In case of places like Somalia, where the mission was nice and clear-cut when we first went in, but it's becoming a little more difficult now. We will have to continue our calculus of political objective, means applied to that objective, and sort them out. But because things get difficult, you don't cut and run. You work the problem and try to find a correct solution. I'm pleased that the philosophy I've just espoused has seen favor with the two presidents and the two secretaries of defense that I've worked for in the past 4 years. We've learned our lesson, I think. At the end of the day, though, strategy and force structure and matters such as I have been talking about kind of go by the wayside. At the end of the day, all of our plans and missions we have in mind rest on the shoulder of the individual GI. Be he a soldier, a sailor, airman, a Marine, or Coast Guardsman, he or she is at the heart and soul of our armed forces. Cold, tired, frightened, away from home, a soldier of the nation, willing to go anywhere, to do anything, to sacrifice whatever is required for the mission. Hundreds of thousands of such wonderful young men and women, trained and bonded together, make up the armed forces of the United States. They are a treasure, and they count on us, all of us here today, for leadership, for support, and for caring for them. I am so very proud to have been one of them for the past 35 years, and for the last 4 years to have represented them. It all ends for me on Thursday. I've been a soldier all my life. I've never wanted to be anything else. I've loved every single minute of it, and I thank the nation for having given me the opportunity to serve in the proud armed forces of the United States. Thank you. Do I get the mug now?
You can have the mug or what's behind door number 1, right over there. You've said that you won't talk about politics, but if you won't talk about politics, will you tell us when you will talk about politics?
Not today, certainly, and I don't know when or if. Thank you. No. The question comes up all the time, but I have been religious with respect to the answer of that question. Active duty military officers have no business talking about partisan political matters. And so nobody knows what party I belong to or don't belong to or may belong to. There's total confusion as to what my political philosophy might or might not be. This is the way it should be. I serve in all military officers, not Colin Powell, but it's part of our code. We serve the nation, we serve the American people, and the representative of the American people is the President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, determined by the political process. So for that reason, none of us do it. It's not just Colin Powell. After I retire and have entered public life and have had a chance to collect my wits and thoughts, as I have said on more than one occasion, I hope to do something that is in service to the nation in some capacity. Whether that's political or not remains to be seen. I have nothing inside of me at the moment saying it has to be political. I think there are many ways to serve the nation. I think President Clinton talked to this with his national service speech not too long ago, and I just hope that I can find something that will allow me to continue serving in some way and make a contribution.
The situation in Russia, Georgia, and the other former Soviet republics increasingly are resulting in armed conflict. How dangerous are these situations, and how, after defense reorganization, are we prepared to deal with such hot spots?
I think they are dangerous situations. We're seeing terrible fragmentation in some of the former republics of the Soviet Union. It is not clear to me that many of these will require direct U.S. involvement, if any of them will require such involvement. But certainly we have to lend our diplomatic and political efforts to the resolution of these conflicts. The real challenge is for the new leadership in Russia and in the other republics to try to put in place as quickly as possible political processes that will allow these age-old, in some cases, ethnic feuds to be resolved through political means and not through the use of the gun. Parts of the Eurasian landmass have picked up right where they were 100 years ago, and fighting over boundaries that didn't make sense and false separation of ethnic groups that didn't make sense. And I'm afraid we are in for a number of years of this kind of conflict. It is my hope that in due course a bit of exhaustion will set in as people realize that they aren't going to be able to prevail through the use of arms, and give an opportunity for the United Nations or other like-minded coalitions to insert themselves and help get the political process started. I look at some of the experience we had here in our hemisphere, in El Salvador, Nicaragua, terrible conflicts, brother against brother, sister against sister. But in due course, with some work and the diplomatic effort and helping those who seem to be on the right side of the issue, we were able to arrive at conclusions that have turned out to be satisfactory, even if tenuous. It will take time. And so I hope that we do not see too much violence like this, but I'm afraid it will be the case. But the ultimate solution has to be political reconciliation among these warring groups.
What nation do you feel that will be our main military threat in the future? China, North Korea, or other?
I really don't know. I do not see a nation out there right now with the military capacity to directly challenge the armed forces of the United States. We are at the top of the pile. We want to keep it that way. I don't apologize for it. I will defend it out of uniform just as strongly as I've defended it in uniform. It's good to be the baddest guy on the block. It sometimes serves a very useful purpose in this very troubled world. So I don't see anybody out there that we can't deal with. I hope that as China comes out of its period of transition, it will come out in a peaceful way, willing to work with its neighbors, and that should be our objective. In Southwest Asia, I think we have to keep a close eye on Iraq, whether Mr. Hussein is there or not, Iran, and perhaps one or two other troubled places in that part of the world. The stakes are too high for us not to be involved and not to be ready to do something. North Korea is perhaps the greatest enigma, because it is an enigma. It is a well-armed state in deep economic difficulty that seems to be spending the remaining part of its treasury to develop nuclear weapons, hoping that those weapons will give them some political or military power that they do not now enjoy. And I don't think that will be the case, and we have to try to constrain them as they move in that direction. But I don't see a single nation that I would identify out here now as being a major threat to the United States or the world peace. That's good. Let's keep it that way, and one of the surest ways of keeping it that way is for the United States to remain engaged on the world stage, and for the armed forces of the United States to get much, much smaller, but to stay just as good as they are now, and demonstrate that same image of professionalism, competence, and we can take care of business attitude that you've seen in recent crises.
There's been a lot of talk lately about the need for an exit strategy before sending troops on a peacekeeping mission. Can you give some examples of how this would be applied to Bosnia? And did we not have an exit strategy for Somalia?
It's very useful when you're getting into something to have a pretty good idea how you're going to get out of it. Seems pretty straightforward to me. With respect to Somalia, for the UNITAF part of the operation, that was the part that we really led from December through May. We had a clear objective when we were going in: save lives, get the food moving, control the warlords. We did that. We did it very well. And our exit strategy was, as the UN prepared itself to take over, help them, and then when they said they were ready to take over, we pulled back, let it become a UN operation. We'll contribute to that UN operation with logistics troops and a quick reaction force. The exit strategy for the UN is to stand up some sort of political entity that can take responsibility for Somalia, led by Somalians, with a Somalian police force to keep order. We have not done that badly. UNITAF was a clear success. What UNISOM is doing now is also marked by mostly success. There is no return to starvation of the kind we saw before out in the countryside. Places outside of Mogadishu are doing rather well. Police forces are standing up. Local district councils are beginning to function. The problem really is localized, and it's localized in South Mogadishu. And what we have to do now is to work that problem through a variety of means, the military means, presence of U.S. forces, but bringing in other forces that have been pledged to come into Somalia and to work in Mogadishu to give us greater presence in South Mogadishu. And we also need a political process that will continue the marginalization of General Adid. But in any day of the week, a warlord can make news if he succeeds in attacking UN forces and injuring some or killing some. But as they are making these news flashes every several days, regrettably, let's not lose sight of the overall success of the mission. The exit strategy will get the political process in place in Somalia, raise up the district councils, put a functioning police force in, turn more and more over to the UN so that the U.S. can move out our quick reaction force, and so that ultimately the UN can complete its mission. I don't know if they'll be as successful as they have been in Cambodia, but the UN is shooting to see if they can complete this whole process by early in 1995, and we are committed to help them with that. So there is an exit strategy. We have good days and bad. We have some successes to the strategy, and we've had some disappointments and failures. Work the problem.
Could you address Bosnia on that same question?
I'm sorry. Bosnia is a far, far more difficult challenge. We'll have to see what the Bosnian Muslim parliament does in the next 24 hours and see whether or not we have an agreement. The thinking of most people in the administration, as well as our friends in Europe, is that if we are going in to help implement an agreement, then it must be a real agreement, an agreement that the parties are willing to abide by. And so that's one of the entry-level questions. And the exit strategy has to be related to how long do we have to stay there to put in place the terms of the agreement and see that everybody is complying with the terms that they signed up to. And when the boundaries have been settled, and when the relocation of people has taken place, and when there is a reasonable level of stability so that internal police forces can manage the peace, then I think it would be appropriate for NATO forces, if NATO forces had gone in because the conditions were appropriate, for NATO forces and UN forces and UN political leadership to turn the situation back over to the signatories of the agreement. But it will be a very, very complex military undertaking if it comes about, and it will be a very, very complex political undertaking as well, by several of orders of magnitude above that which we have seen in Somalia, in my judgment. But it's something that may well have to be done in the interest of bringing peace to that troubled land, even if it is not a perfect peace, even if it is not a peace that gives us a great deal of satisfaction. At least we can get the killing stopped before winter comes, so that we can then see what the future will bring in terms of adjustments that the parties may wish to make between themselves in the future. The important thing, it seems to be now, is to get the killing stopped before winter gets too far along.
The role of the United Nations has changed quite a bit over recent years in these areas, and the role of NATO is also changing. What do you predict over the next 5 or 10 years for both of these organizations?
I'm big on NATO. Spent a lot of time on it over the last several years, but I think NATO continues to be the basis for stability in the West and coherence and cohesion in the West, and it also seems to be the basis for new stability in the East. Everybody's trying to get in. And one of the major reasons that it serves as this twin pillar of stability, if I can call it that, is because of the North Atlantic link. When people are in NATO or trying to get in NATO, they see a link to North America to the United States and Canada as sort of the offshore guarantors of that security. So I think NATO remains a growth industry. With respect to the United Nations, I hope the United Nations will continue to take on these peacekeeping missions that are around the world, and which they have to take on. That's the charter. What we have to do, as President Clinton noted yesterday, is to do a better job of organizing ourselves and organizing the UN to take on these missions. Yes, there will be rocky times in Somalia and rocky times in Bosnia, places like that. And when you have so many sovereign nations all trying to work together, there's bound to be disagreement and confusion. But you got to just keep working through all that so that you can achieve the kinds of successes we have seen in the last 5 years, if I can use that same window. Iran-Iraq War, UN. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, UN. Cambodia, UN. Some of the resolution of the problems in our own hemisphere, Nicaragua, El Salvador, had a UN underpinning. So the UN is doing marvelous work. Namibian elections, just wonderful work going on. So we have to continue to support the UN. We have to pay our arrears. It is not responsible of us to ask for so much from the UN while we are one of the biggest debtors. And we have to help the UN rise to its responsibilities by giving them the wherewithal to do the job that I think the UN was created to do, and which I think must be done by such an organization in the future if we are going to achieve the promise and the hope that I think is out there in the future.
Could you comment on the future of women in the military, especially in the wake of the tailhook incident and other such incidents?
I think women have a very bright future in the military. Years ago when I was a Corps commander, people used to ask, well, do you support women in combat? I said, look, if the Russians, when we had them, when the Red Army was on the other side of the Fulda Gap from my Corps, on day 1, hour 1, women will be in combat and will be casualties. So women are an integral part of our force, and there's just no question about it, and their future is bright. There remain a couple of fields within the military where I don't think women should be, and that is our current policy, and that has to do with ground combat operations, armor operations, and some form of artillery activity and cavalry operation because of the intense nature of those operations, because of the close nature of those operations, and the kind of bonding you need in units of that kind. They really have to be all male in my judgment. That may sound very old-fashioned of me, but I think it has a good, sound basis, and I think the American people understand that. Don't get me any more trouble I'm in, please. So for all of the other fields, women should be allowed to rise to the top, and they are rising to the top, and more power to them. And I think the burden has to be on us to deny something to women in the military. And I think we have come a long way over the last 10 or 15 years, and we're really down now to close combat. Opening up fighter pilot seats, I think, was a major step that Secretary Aspen took earlier this year. And we're really down to ground combat, and my judgment is that that is the only area that should remain restricted from women. With respect to tailhook, we are all terribly upset about tailhook. We wish it had not happened. It was inappropriate behavior, no question about it. We have gone through a very traumatic period as a result of tailhook. But the beauty about the armed forces is that we can deal with problems like this. We will learn from this mistake. We've already learned from this mistake. We are training our forces to the proper role with respect to relationships between men and women, and what is acceptable behavior and what is not. And so we are going through the last few chapters of the tailhook story, and then I think we'll be on our way. If there's one thing we can do, it's correct and adapt in ways, frankly, far superior to other institutions within the nation.
Okay, before asking the final question, I'd like to present you with a gift, certificate of appreciation from the National Press Club. Very valuable, very attractive, gilded blue mug. And this is an expensive gift. We didn't pay for it, but it's an expensive gift. Ion Washington, the Presidents Who Have Known Me, by New York Times photographer George Thames. Thank you. The final question is, there's a new book out talking about the blustery nature of General Schwarzkopf, and a biography of you just released said you're not happy with parts of General Schwarzkopf, of his autobiography. Can you talk about that?
General Schwarzkopf is one of the best friends I have in the world. General Schwarzkopf was a very distinguished commander during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He and I had a very close personal relationship. We talked every day. You can't have an intense relationship like that doing things we were doing without having total confidence in one another. And you can't have an experience like that that was perfect every day with no raised voices. Perhaps one of the differences between Norm and me is I raise my voice a little bit differently than he does. But you people have days where you get a little excited. It was exciting times. None of this debate, either in books about me or books about the war or books about General Schwarzkopf, should in any way be seen as undercutting or in any way putting in a negative light the magnificent performance of one of the finest generals I've ever known, Norm Schwarzkopf.
Here's the other kicker.
Thank you very much.
Ellen, come with us when we go out.